So we have just wrapped up week number 5 of Mythic Plus Season 1 Dragonflight. It was a fortified, spiteful Grievous week. And in this video, I'm going to be going over what I've been doing for the week, which has mostly been taking my casting Mistweaver into 19, 20, 21s. If you're interested in the build specifically, just released a video going over it, so you can find that on my channel. After that, I'm going to be looking at discussing how the healing meta continues to shape up. And I'm going to try and go into a little bit more detail regarding what I think the healing meta at the moment revolves around and why the good healers are good and why the weak healers are weak. And then finally, I'm going to be looking at the dungeon ease tier list. So how the dungeon difficulty meta is panning out, specifically after the kind of last round of nerfs. So to start off with, Mistweaver. Now, prior to this week, a couple of days prior to this week, in one of my earlier videos, I talked about how I had basically thrown together a casting Mistweaver build, and I thought it was really good, and I was going to try and push it into higher keys and see how it goes. So that's effectively what I did this week. And I went from pugging even 10s, but a lot of 12s to 14 range keys to running a 20, and then luckily enough being able to kind of use that plus 20 best key Raider IO on my tooltip to get into quite a few 18 and 19 pug groups and then run some 20 and 21s with some friends. Now, I am not a God gamer or anything, but I am God gamer adjacent. I have some mates who are built diffy. They're really, really good players. I think a few of them at the moment are 3K plus or very close to it. And they were kind enough to take me into a couple of keys on my Mistweaver. Now, I think a casting Mistweaver from the healing perspective is much stronger than most people think or realize at the moment. I think it is certainly stronger than a fist weaving build for healing. Obviously it does less damage. But as far as going into a higher key or a much higher key than I am used to, and having some level of confidence that I could heal through the kind of unavoidable damage mechanics like the Tempest Lightning Storm ability, and being able to top people up quickly after Gale Arrow and things like that, that's where I felt like the caster build really excelled, where those are the sorts of things that I have struggled with on a Fistweaver in the past. Now, definitely there are Fistweavers that can do it, but I certainly felt like it was an easier thing to achieve on the caster build. And that's because the throughput is much more directed, it can be much higher, and it is much more on demand. The footage you're watching is the very first 20 that I stepped into. At the time, I was 391 item level, I believe, so very under-geared for that kind of key level, and some of the damage patterns were quite touch and go. I would like to say that most of the scary parts of healing that I encountered this week was to do with my lack of preparedness and lack of familiarity with healing higher keys, rather than shortcomings or difficulties with the spec itself. The more 20s and 21s I have run, and the more I have planned out what cooldowns I was going to trade into certain abilities, and setting up my bigwigs and things to give me alerts a few seconds before the damage starts so I can press my cooldowns and get ready for high throughput. The more I've been able to do that, the more comfy and manageable keys have become. I've also managed to start eking out a lot more damage than I was very early on in the higher keys. And that is partly because I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Healing a 20 or a 21 was very daunting to me, right? Going from a 14 or a 15 as my best key to just stepping straight into a 20. Wasn't quite sure how health bars were going to move or how shiesty things were going to get. So I was simultaneously kind of trying to conserve my mana as much as I could, but also be very liberal at some times to just spread out excessive healing, because I wasn't sure if the tank needed healing on this particular pack or for this particular ability, or if I could wait, slowly heal someone up over 5 seconds, or I had to respond to every bit of incoming damage with enveloping mist and things like that. So my gameplay isn't great and certainly not optimized. I also really did not use defensives well at all. But overall, I was actually very happy with what I could do on a casting Mistweaver. I'm going to get into a little bit more of why that is in a minute when I start talking about the healing meta and what I think makes a strong healer at the moment. But first, I'll quickly go over how getting into the higher keys has kind of changed my perspective a little bit on the rest of the healers. And that is going to very broadly boil down into two categories. The Resto Shaman, Holy Priest, Disciplined Priest for me, going into a couple of phoning in a couple of weekly vault keys for those guys after playing my Mistweaver so much this week has, I guess you could say, made me think that Mistweaver is much better than those three, or that Mistweaver is still bad and those other three are even worse. I'm not sure how I really want to think about it, but the things that really stood out to me was that Holy Priest and Discipline specifically are really lacking throughput cooldowns. I think their rotational healing is fine. I think if you play perfectly around certain situations and you're planning to spend, 3, 4, 5 different globals back to back, and you happen to not have to move or have to respond to anything else at the right time. I get to kind of give you an example of this. If I'm healing the Tempest Storm in Not Good Offensive on a healer that has some strong cooldowns to lean into, especially something like Mistweaver that has Yulon up every minute and the storm happens about every minute, it means I can always trade a very strong throughput cooldown into that storm. So all of a sudden that boss fight ceases to be particularly difficult. It's more of like, as long as I plan out my cooldowns and respond appropriately, that boss fight becomes much more manageable. Whereas on a Holy Priest, healing through those storms might look something like making sure I've saved up all 4 charges of my holy words, and then make absolutely sure that I am very quickly choosing the right targets for the right heals to cycle through all 4 holy words during the lightning storm, while also getting the correct light weaving heal or flash heal off that is buffed by the crit talents, I think it's Pontifex, in between each of those casts. So the long story short is, to me at least, the Holy Priest, Disciplined Priest, and Resto Shaman to a somewhat lesser extent, because Resto Shaman has some very good cooldowns, just they're not available that often. But those 3 healers feel like you're kind of trying to mesh quite a complicated kind of ramp into boss mechanics. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Because the Holy Priest, for example, if I have to clear Thundering while collecting orbs, while preparing for the storm, or I get Thundering and have to clear it or something during the storm, all of a sudden that's something Holy Priest can't do because I have to stand still to cast. And my mobility is very limited. And the kind of, I guess, what I'm trying to get to here is that I feel like Holy Priest, Disciplined Priest, and Resto Shaman are very reliant on powerful combos being played at the exact right time to heal through high damage pattern like burst windows, like Hersha Storm, Tempest Storm, Grey Wing, Frostbomb overlap with Absolute Zero, those kind of mechanics. Whereas the casting Mistweaver Monk, Resto Druid, Preservation Evoker, those guys can kind of answer those heavy damage patterns with usually 1 cooldown. And that, I think, is what makes them so strong. There was a very convoluted segue into talking about the meta. I think what makes the meta healers so good right now is that they can quite simply push out a lot of healing throughput without having to rely on very particular kind of rotational abilities used at the exact right time or in the exact right combination. And for me especially, for pushing into higher keys for the first time and trying to kind of learn how the group plays or where people usually position or how much damage goes out in any particular boss fight at a certain level, learning those kind of patterns was much easier for me on a healer, where I could really just press 1 button and then spam another button. Like I could just press Yulon and then spam Enveloping Mist, and I knew that my AoE healing was covered. That was really nice. And I could even get a fair bit of movement in between those abilities with rolls or teleports if I had to, which was great. And I noticed the same thing even in the lower weekly keys on my Preservation Evoker, Resto Druid, Holy Paladin even, because those healers felt like I had a lot more time to do other things. I could run around and clear Thundering, or I could move to get out of a patch of fire on the ground or something, while also doing a high amount of throughput on those healers. And Preservation in particular felt like I could just do so much healing without really having to rely on many globals. I could do a lot of healing with one button or two buttons. Even something as simple as Greywing, the second last boss in Azure Vaults. When the frost bombs go out and the whole group drops down to low health, usually no healers have any problems with that situation. Where it gets tricky is there are a couple of times in that fight where that frostbomb damage has a somewhat quick overlap with the absolute zero cast. So on all of my healers, especially after pushing into higher keys, I felt like I was always looking for a cooldown to get through those sort of overlaps. And on my Evoker, my Druid, my Holy Paladin, my Mistweaver, I always had a very powerful button to press for that. And there were always powerful enough abilities that they gave me excessive throughput. So I could heal through the frostbomb damage to get ready for the absolute zero cast while moving around, while running to the rune, while clearing Thundering and things like that. And I think that's what really makes those classes stand out so much at the moment. Preservation also, for whatever reason, just doesn't spend much mana. I even play the Temporal Anomaly build, which is meant to be a very high mana cost ability that you spam out quite often, and I still have less mana issues or no mana issues at all on my Evoker, whereas a Discipline Priest or even my Mistweaver, I can go just doing damage. Holy Paladin also seems to spend almost no mana if you don't really want to. The other takeaway for me this week, or the other thing I've been noticing a lot, is that Mistweaver mobility is excellent. And I think that is probably the lesser talked about thing here, is one of the other reasons why Preservation and Resto Druid are just so good and always in an S tier by themselves, is because they have all of the throughput and all the tankiness and everything that people usually think about when they think about healers. But they also have excellent mobility. And while Mistweaver throughput might not be at the same level as Druid or Evoker, even though I personally think it could be pretty close, especially after 10.0.5. That's probably another video to talk about those kind of things, but Mistweaver mobility has really stood out to me this week. Having triple roll with teleport, with Tiger's Lust has just felt excellent. And for a healer that relies very heavily on hard casts, it doesn't feel like it. At least not to the same extent that something like Holy Priest does or Resto Shaman does. They are both healers that, I mean, fundamentally are the same or a similar archetype to a casting Mistweaver, in that they really need to hard cast heals to move health bars. And at least when I do that on a Mistweaver, if I end up in a terrible position while waiting to finish a cast or to quickly spot heal someone before I move, having roll or teleport and things makes a huge difference to making that feel smooth. Whereas trying to do the same thing on a Holy Priest with just Feather, many times I would definitely struggle with. Resto Shaman at least can take gusts, even though it's not at the same kind of level as something like roll, even though usually it would get used in the same way. As far as the meta itself goes, in a surprise to absolutely no one, Subcreation still has Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker in S tier by themselves. This is again based on the top 3,000 or so runs for the week, pulled from the WoW API. At the moment, this is ranging from 20 to 26 keys. What is a little surprising is that Holy Paladin has dropped down to B tier along with Holy Priest. Personally, I'm not quite sure why this is. I felt Holy Paladin was excellent this week. I had no troubles whatsoever with Grievous. I was playing a Beacon of Virtue build, which I think I'll be playing from now on my Paladin. And that is because as I look to push into higher keys, what I worry about or what I think about having to really heal through is just AoE mechanics. I'm not ever really particularly worried about single target healing outside of Temple of the Jade Serpent. It's usually AoE healing that is the challenge. And that is exactly what Beacon of Virtue excels at. Being able to press Beacon of Virtue and then, a heal or two heals on whichever target didn't get the buff to top my whole team felt a little bit like playing Preservation and being able to spread echoes on the whole team, wait for the damage to go out and then press one button like Verdant Embrace and your whole team is topped. Those kind of very bursty group-wide healing buttons that are up very, very often are really, they feel like cooldowns that are in even rotational healing that it's in a little bit of a league of its own. The ability to very, very quickly top health bars, very often also the kinds of buttons you can rely on for every single damaging event or group damaging event. That is definitely at the moment the realm of Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker. I'm also not entirely sure why Holy Priest is in B tier. And that is to say, I'm not sure why it's so high. There could just be a lot of Priest players who are choosing to just avoid Discipline and play Holy, which could be why they're up so high on the tier list, and also why Disc is so low, or at least play part of a role in that. There could also just be some God Gamer Holy Priests out there who have no trouble going into high keys and doing their little 4, 5, 6 button perfect ramp, quick target selection kind of healing burst to get through the trickier parts of dungeon healing at the moment. And by that I mean there could be quite a few very, very good Holy Priests that go into like a Herja Eye of the Storm, for example, who go into every storm and perfectly rotate their 4 Holy Words with their 4 Lightweaver heals and everything all on the right targets to make the spec perform very well. As for Resto Shamans being in D tier, I think this is down to a couple of things. They have lost a fair amount of their identity and their strength, especially in Mythic Plus, with all other healers except priests receiving a kick. They've also had to pick and choose some of their utility, while at the same time a lot of other specs got more utility, and much of the niche that was Resto Shaman has now been taken over by Evoker. The mastery for Evoker is basically the same as Resto Shaman, but strictly better. They both have strong stacked healing, strong cooldown healing, and somewhat slightly lacking single target healing, but Evoker has much higher numbers in all of those niches than Shaman does. I am hoping that the F tier improves in the next couple of weeks. I think the changes coming to Discipline Priest in 10.0.5 will be quite large. I don't know where they're going to end up on the tier list, but I imagine quite a few current Holy players will have a reason to switch back to Disc, if that's what they prefer. I also think just Disc gets numerically much stronger in 10.0.5. I think the kind of Dark Disc style coming back with Dark Reprimand, with the 2 charges of Mind Blast and things, are going to hopefully help out the spec quite a lot. And I am cautiously optimistic that those changes will mean that Discs will be able to kind of press their Shadow Covenant, press their Dark Penance, use their Mind Blast charges, and be able to dish out a huge amount of group healing every 30-40 seconds when they need to. And I think that kind of very high burst group healing is exactly what they're lacking. As for Mistweaver, I think Mistweaver has a lot to do with community perception. Right now, everyone seems to think they're really bad. I especially think that the caster build is better than people think, but I also know, at least from Raider.io, is that most people play Fistweaver at the moment. And I think that could be a large part of what's holding them back in F tier. They are also the healer that I believe has the lowest participation rate, the fewest number of people playing the spec, which I guess doesn't help their representation in high keys. I think at the end of the day, both Fistweaving and casting versions of Mistweaver are viable, but I think it comes down to personal preference on which to play. Do you want to do damage somewhat for free and work hard for your healing, or do you want to do healing for free and work hard for your damage? That's how I'm seeing both of those kind of builds at the moment. As far as dungeons go, Shadowmoon Burial Grounds is still S tier, Court of Stars is still A. I think Knockhood and Algathar are probably the 2 best balanced dungeons at the moment. I think neither of them are free keys, but I also think neither of them are too hard. Both of them are difficult and manageable on Fortified and Tyrannical for different reasons. But I see all of the top 4 as being quite good dungeons right now. I even don't think that it's a terrible thing that Court of Stars and Burial Grounds are basically free. Whenever I have one of these keys, I have no shortage of people who want to run it. Whenever I'm doing keys with someone and I, suggest the next key and say, does anyone want to run this place? If it's one of those top 4, generally everyone's happy to run them. As far as the final 4 though, these are kind of like the 4 problem childs of balance at the moment, or left in the season so far. I think Temple of the Jade Serpent is a dungeon that becomes a pain for the tank and the healer specifically, but not so much for the DPS. There isn't a great deal to manage or kick. Most of the trash packs are quite manageable for that reason. The dungeon itself doesn't feel overly long or anything. None of the bosses are particularly hard. The DPS especially, you just kind of like avoid the bad stuff on the ground and play like normal for the most part. The last boss can require some more coordination and good defensive usage, but for the most part, Temple is a tank and healer mechanics dungeon. And I think that's part of why it's in D, especially the tank damage. Trying to hug a Temple of the Jade Serpent on an 18 or above is almost entirely down to what tank you pick. Now, if you run with a really good Prot Warrior, the whole dungeon gets a lot more manageable because Spell Reflect is amazing, and they always seem to have a defensive up for every tank buster. But some of the other tanks really struggle to survive some of the bigger hits in that place. A lot of the tank busters are magical damage, and that seems to just fold a lot of tanks in half. Same thing with healers. If you get really good healers and the Stone Step boss and the last boss are managed well by the healer, then the rest of the dungeon should be fine. And same goes with making sure, again, even on the second last boss, that your tank and your healer are on the same page, that you're not overlapping cooldowns, that you do have a cooldown for every blackout kick in the second phase. But for now, I get the feeling that the tank and healing requirements in that dungeon is what's holding it in D tier, especially tank. Trying to even pull the last pack on Fortified is probably the hardest part of the entire dungeon. As far as Ruby Life Pool goes, a lot of the problem or pain points of Ruby Life Pools got nerfed yesterday, like this week, and that is that both the two last bosses got many of their damaging abilities nerfed. So the Inferno Core dot, the big AoE damage and dot on the second last boss, as well as the particularly difficult trash, which is the upstairs trash around the ring. Both dragons got nerfed by 25%, and the big AoE party-wide damage ability on the destroyers called Inferno, that is the hardest to heal trash in the entire game right now, got nerfed as well. So that's going to be great. So for now, or for this week, Ruby Life Pools was in D, which makes sense. Very difficult to heal dungeon, although for the tank and the DPS, the dungeon's actually not too bad. It was really just a massive healer check, and the abilities that made it a healer check have been nerfed significantly. So that should be a much better dungeon next week. The two dungeons in F tier, Azure Vaults and Halls of Valor. These two dungeons are in F tier for the exact same reason, and that is the timer on both of these dungeons is extremely short, or it makes routes for both of these places quite difficult, is I guess another way to put this. I've had quite a few pug dungeons for vaults and halls this week. Most of them felt pretty good. For time, very clean, no deaths, everyone was kind of doing their job, everything went fairly smoothly, but still never made the timer. What makes vaults and halls difficult is effectively the same thing. It's the timer. And what that means is that in order to get more time, you have to pull more packs together. Now in Halls of Valor, the way that is usually done is that you pull as many packs together as you can in the normal middle of the dungeon, where all the casters and the archers and everything are. You pull as much of that in double pulls or triple pulls even as you possibly can. And all you're really doing there is not pulling anything with, I believe they're called sentinels. The sentinels that give crowd control immunity to allies. You can't pull them with anything else, but you avoid them and everything else you pull together. And then when you're in the Fenrir side, you make up for everything you can't multi-pull in the rest of the dungeon by pulling huge packs of bears or wolves to make time. Now, if you're in a pug and you can't do a route like that, you basically can't time, I would say, a 19 or a 20 Halls of Valor. You need those kind of routes where you do massive pulls all the time in order to time a 20-21 Halls of Valor. The same is true for Azure Vaults. What makes it particularly difficult in Azure Vaults is that that dungeon is just cram full of trash packs that have 15 different abilities. Some of these got nerfed today as well, but not really nerfed in the way that's going to make that any easier to handle. The big tank frontal that the rock guys do got its damage nerfed by 25%, I believe. Doesn't really change anything because that ability one-shots tanks anyway, and it's stunnable. So every group that I ran vaults with always stopped all those casts anyway. So having something like that nerfed doesn't really change anything. What makes vaults difficult is that even though you can skip a lot of the ring trash, you end up having to pull a lot of that trash together in double or triple pulls in order to get enough time to time the key. And what that means is that in a pug, it becomes, again, almost impossible because you just don't have enough kicks and you don't have well coordinated enough stuns, and you generally don't always have the group that has enough crowd control to stop every cast and every tank frontal and tank buster and stuff that happens. So those two dungeons for me were by far the hardest this week. I tried quite a few times to pug them on 18 or 19 and failed every single one of them. Except I think one Halls I got an 18, and that was one of the cleanest dungeons I have ever done in my entire World of Warcraft history. And I think we beat the timer by like a minute 30. So unfortunately, regardless of the nerfs, there were even a couple of trash health nerfs in vaults. But I still think that unless the timer gets adjusted on these dungeons, they will remain in F tier and they will remain the most difficult dungeons in the season. As far as what Blizzard could do to balance some of these out if they really wanted to, I think most people would agree that Burial Grounds could probably take 2 minutes off the timer, and Vault probably needs those 2 minutes added onto the timer. Vault also needs more checkpoints for runbacks. That place is an absolute nightmare. I know it gives you the speed boost if you release, but the amount of time lost just from even one DPS dying on one trash pack can be the difference between you timing a key and not timing a key. Any wipe anywhere in the dungeon is basically an instantly bricked key, and the ability spam in vaults in particular needs to be, in my opinion, looked at. I think the number of abilities is okay. It's kind of like a Ruby Life Pool situation to me a little bit. I think the different abilities and the number of abilities is okay, but they need to be spammed far less often. If DPS aren't prioritizing the destroyers in Ruby Life Pools, there probably shouldn't be 4 Infernos that go off on every trash pack. It's an insane amount of healing that's required and cooldowns that are required to heal each Inferno, that it effectively means if you get a group with even slightly low DPS or have 1 DPS that dies to something, that pack becomes unkillable because the destroyers live too long. So ability spam in vaults and Ruby Life Pools, as well as I would have said the abilities that all got nerfed in Life Pools are all things that I would have highlighted here as things that need to be nerfed. The Inferno damage itself, the boss abilities on the last 2 bosses that do crazy ticking damage, like the Inferno call on last boss, last week on a Fortified, on a 20, ticks for 53k damage per second on 3 targets. It gets a little bit extreme. If I was being very particular, I think Noku Defensive and Temple of the Jade Serpent could probably use with 1 pack less required for count. That is because in Noku Defensive, most groups will kind of like clear all the trash that they want to, and then they'll kill the second last boss, and then they'll usually kill 1 or 2 more packs before heading to the last boss. I think we could just do without those extra 1 or 2 packs. I think there's plenty of trash before the first boss, plenty before the second, plenty before the third. I don't think you really need even more before you even head to the last boss. In Temple of the Jade Serpent, you don't have much reason to skip any of the trash in the dungeon except for avoiding the torch ability. So in high keys, most groups, what they end up doing is you go and kill the water boss and you do that whole corridor of trash. And then when you go off to the other side and you head over to Stone Step, you skip the first pack. The first 2 named mobs that throw the torch debuff on people, that torch debuff hits so hard and ticks for so much that it becomes unhealable quite quickly. So most groups will just shroud or invis that, but then they have to go into a part of the dungeon that most people have never even seen to pull an extra pack or 2 to get enough count. I think that we could just lower the count a little bit so that you can at least skip 1 pack in the dungeon and still get count. For this whole season, I have only been playing Oceanic keys. Part of that reason is because in a dungeon like Vaults on Greywing, when the frost bombs go out, if I'm playing on a US West server with 250 to 300 MS, it is impossible most of the time for me to get off a frost bomb without taking 2 ticks of the damage, the ground damage. And that means death in like a semi-high key. One of the things I had written down to complain about in this video, but this is actually also one of the things that Blizzard have nerfed this week, so that's great to see. So the frost bombs won't do the ground dot ticking damage for 2 seconds after they're dropped, which is going to be great. As far as the Halls of Valor timer goes, this is actually a bit of a difficult one to solve in my opinion. I don't think adding more time to the timer is necessarily the best way to go about it. I mean, it would fix the problem, but it's already quite a long dungeon. Making it even longer probably isn't going to feel great. Also, just making it less count is probably also not a great idea because we already skip a lot of trash, and having to skip even more is probably going to make rogues feel mandatory, or multiple invis pots or something isn't going to be great either. What I wouldn't mind seeing actually is just removing the RP on the last 2 bosses. I think that's about 3 minutes of time saved, which is probably about how much time needs to be added to the timer without actually making the timer longer, if that makes sense. So just removing the RP would go a long way to making halls much better. That is going to be it for this week. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and algorithm stuff.